Hey YouTube, it's been a couple of weeks since I pulled all the turbo out. I now have all the parts back and ceramic coated, everything's ready to go in. So it's time to get the turbo back in the car, so I've got a little bit of prep work to do. I'm going to be starting by cleaning all the surfaces for the gaskets and all the blow-by from the exhaust that's all over the head before I get everything installed. And then installation should hopefully be the reverse of removal.
I was wrong.
Alright, safety glasses for this one. So I've started by stuffing all the ports with some foam. I know people like to use paper towel. If you have this kind of foam packaging stuff, it's actually a lot more resilient and it sort of springs out, stops it from moving, gives you a better seal so stuff doesn't go back into it. I was going to pop the studs out and just go over it with a level sanding block on like 1500 grit, but there's actually an intentional lip here. So I've decided to just hit it with the rotary tool and just a little scrubber, a little buffing tool, and just clean it up that way. Alright, well that's now all cleaned up, plus I've had a chance to clean up some other mess in there from a failed air conditioning condenser. Now I need to check that all the studs are in tight and aren't going to back out, which is a really common problem with doing turbo conversions on MX-5s. So these studs are all the ones that haven't backed out, though I know that some of these have been loose before. I'm going to be tightening these all back in and then I'll be replacing this one. What tends to happen with turbo conversions on your turbo manifolds and on the manifold up onto the head is that the studs will back out after the first heat cycle and you need to tighten them up after your first run. Because of the way that this is all laid out, that's not possible. Once I put the turbo here, I will not be able to access most of these studs down the bottom. And so what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be getting my blowtorch and I will be heating up each of these studs and then cooling them down as if I was trying to break the thread free to remove them, but I'll actually be tightening them again once they're cool, so that way I can simulate the heat cycle. Oh man, they go on so smooth with the threads clean. That's a new life experience, clean threads on the exhaust. Wow. All right, let's get this shiny boy back in place. First thing to do though is a new gasket. I mean, like, that's the whole point of the job. I actually bought this when I bought the car.
One eternity later.
Well, easy, completely installed, job's done, let's go. Except for all the difficult places to reach now. Okay, what is going on here? And it's not like it's not flat, like I have checked. Almost feels like that's pivoting there. I was having a bit of trouble getting the manifold on, and it felt like it was pivoting around the middle. So I went and found the original stud which had backed out, which is this one here, and these are the new studs. Turns out that the stud that they used was shorter so that they could get the clearance for the manifold to fit. Weird gasket. Well, that works now. That's an improvement. That is a lot easier with that thread cleaned up. Holy crap, what a difference that makes. Each time I do it, I have to flip the spanner to the opposite side so that it, so I can get the skinny side into the, whichever side's closer to the manifold. And you can't do this in any way where you can actually see the nuts. It's all feel. So this is the turbo. It's all been ceramic coated. The outside I've gone for a nice cosmetic finish, and you can see that I've gone for the low gloss black on the rear. But this is the business end here, this grey material. So this is what does most of the heat reflection. So combine the ceramic coating with a fitted turbo blanket. So this guy clears our wastegate, the internal wastegate, which was really neat. It was actually quite hard to find something like that. Not a lot of reviews on these, so for anyone who's looking, I found the PTP turbo blankets to be quite good. So that's exactly what they were advertising, and that's what showed up. So I think between that and the turbo blanket, I should be getting a lot more heat into the turbo and a lot less of it into the engine bay. After thinking it through for a little bit, I decided to assemble the turbo with the dump pipe on the bench. And I think this little bit of footage gives a good example of why. It's not that any of this was particularly inaccessible under the car, it's just that it's definitely a lot easier to control what you're doing while it's out on the bench. There's a couple of spots where it's just that much more difficult to get a spanner or to get the counter turn with the Allen bolt. So by having it on the bench, I could just get everything right. Don't be afraid to use a little bit of WD-40 on barbs for water fittings. It's such a small volume of oil and it's so volatile that it won't make any difference to your coolant system. Just makes life so much easier getting everything on. I decided to put some heat sleeve over the water hoses. I had a look through the service history of the vehicle when I initially bought it, and these water hoses had been replaced once before. They get quite brittle up on the connections on the barbs up near the turbo, and I think the heat sleeve will just help preserve them a bit longer. The other foam piece is just there to protect the hoses from chafing up against the power steering pump, which they run very close to on their way to the front of the block. There it is, all put together. Always make sure you wear gloves when handling a turbo blanket. They might look like you can handle them, but they're actually sort of stitched together with metal and they're really harsh It's really easy to sort of cut yourself with them. I did actually buy the springs to hold the turbo blanket in place, but after mucking around with it for a little while, I decided to just use the tie wire. There were a couple of reasons for this. One is that it was really terrifying the amount of tension that was on those springs, and I figured that after a couple of heat cycles they'll probably break anyway. The other is that the springs were going to get in the way of where I needed to get the studs and nuts on the flange to hold the turbo together. You should also always be wearing gloves when handling fiberglass wrap. It will absolutely destroy your skin. You should also soak the wrap in water. I wish someone had told me that the very first time that I'd ever done a wrap, but it's just like thousands of little needles. And hose clamps are without a doubt the best way to hold it down, because you can get a lot more tension on than the tie downs you normally get. So I've just switched to my phone. I've only just finished bolting up the turbo with its new manifold. And after having done that, I have a feeling that the setup for this car was originally done with the engine out of the vehicle. And the reason I think that is because the difficulty of just installing the turbo, let alone all the other extras such as the way that the air conditioning lines run and so on, I don't think it would have been feasible for them to finish these cars in any reasonable time frame, even in low volume. Let me show you what I mean. So to do this manifold, I have this cut down 14mm so that I could fit around all the gaps. And the reason I needed that is that I can only get a socket over two of the nuts, the one under here, which I can't see, and this one here. The rest of them have to be done with that cut down spanner, otherwise it interferes with the very tight tolerances and clearances. So that was hard even with nothing in the way. But this, I cannot imagine a way that this could have been installed with the turbo, with the engine in the car. This turbo couldn't have been installed. Only these two nuts are accessible from on top. To get to this one here, I had to pull the turbo down, take out this fitting for the oil supply, so I could get a socket over this, then click the handle in to tighten it up, and then took a fair bit of force to drag it out again. But that's not the tricky one. The tricky one's the one down here. So this is why we've gone to the phone, so that I can use it with my little illuminated mirror. So you can see that the nut back there, the clearance on the stud means that I have to get the turbo in place to get the nut started, and then get it in as far as I could before I had to get a spanner in there. It took me more than 3 hours to get the nut started because of the awkward positioning. I had to use my little mirror here with the light to be able to see what was happening. I had to wear a lab glove because this fiberglass that they put on here to protect the heater hose from deterioration from the turbo heat is fiberglass, and it rubs on the back of your hand and irritates it, but I can't wear a normal glove because I need the dexterity in my fingers to do it. So I had to reach this hand under here to get it started, and I had to reach my other hand all the way around the back so that I could use both fingers to roll it round. And then, once I got it started, I needed to make this abomination so that I could get enough clearance going in over that nut to turn it, because with the longer spanner I couldn't get any sort of reliable purchase on it. It was taking me maybe half an hour every time I got the spanner over the nut to get a quarter of a turn in. So this solved that problem, and then I was able to get the larger 12mm in and tighten it up. So yeah, I think that this was all done originally outside the car, because you would have the turbo and manifold fully assembled, And if this is on a stand, all of these nuts underneath are easily accessible. Potentially the dump pipe was not on the engine, but I think it probably was, because even though it's possible to do this one from under the car, it would be incredibly difficult. So I think everything that's there now was done with the engine outside the car, and if I ever did this again, I would 100% lift the engine out, because the time it took would have been slightly less or about the same, but it would have been a lot easier.
What follows is a brief construction montage. We hope you enjoyed this brief construction montage.
So after a lot of battling, everything is now back together, everything's plugged in, everything's tight, and hopefully there are no more leaks, so it's time to check. Now, before I go turning the engine on, I need to put water back in it, because I had to drain it in order to get the turbo out. One of the things that I'll be doing though, is I'll be filling it with just some citric acid like you can buy in the supermarket. Because this block has been exposed to the air for about 2 months now, and it is a steel block, the citric acid will help remove any surface rust or built up scale if you run it in the engine for a couple hours to a week, depending on how bad it is, and it'll clean up really well. I've actually used this to great effect on cars that were older and more rusty. I've had to flush it out several times in some cases, but effectively you just put one of these in your engine with just some tap water, and you let it run up till it's hot, and then you flush it through with some fresh water until it comes out clear, and you just keep doing that until you only get clear water coming out, and then you rinse it out again and you put in some proper coolant. So since I'm just doing leak testing at the moment, I think now is a good time to do this. If it's all good, then I'll just run it with the citric acid for a little while. I realized I haven't burnt the coolant system, but that's okay because it's not going to be running for very long. It's just going to be used for idling and just checking for exhaust leaks. I wasn't really planning on doing an epilogue like this, but I learned enough things along the way that's probably worth just mentioning them. The first is that the engine was absolutely 100% out of the car when they were installing these in the SPs. And the final giveaway that confirmed that is the way that the oil feed line for the turbo is tapped into the back of the head. There is no way that could have been done while the engine was in there. So if you are doing something on one of these cars and it's around the turbo coming out, if you have the ability to, it is definitely easier to lift the engine out on one of these cars and put it back in than it is to do it the way that I did it. Obviously it can be done, but it's just a gigantic pain. So keep that in mind. The other thing is that I did have the car idling for well over an hour on my driveway. I had the camera set up on it, but I just couldn't get the smoking from the turbo blanket and the wrap burning in clearly on my camera. It wasn't until I drove it into my garage when I was done that I was able to just snap a quick video of it with my phone camera, which should be showing up right next to me here, of the blanket smoking as it was cooling off. It's really important that people are aware of that because your car will smell like it's on fire the first time you start these up, and depending on what wrap you get, they can actually burn in really severely. So something to be aware of. Another thing which I didn't mention earlier, which is probably a little bit important that no one ever really mentions, is that when you wrap an exhaust or put a turbo blanket in, they become really good medium for soaking in oil. And if you have an oil spill or you're leaking oil and it soaks into those incredibly hot surfaces, that's a really good way to start an engine fire. So if you are doing something like this on your car, whether it's turbo or naturally aspirated and you're wrapping headers, you should always make sure there are no oil leaks, and it's always a really good idea to keep a fire extinguisher in your car. The third thing is that I wasn't expecting to notice the difference from the turbo blanket or the wrap anywhere near as much as I did. I've wrapped naturally aspirated cars before and you can't really feel anything, but the thing that I noticed is that the boost transition point for the turbo is quite a bit lower. It used to be sort of around 4,000 RPM and now it's probably only just a touch over 3,000 RPM, and the turbo lag when I get on it is noticeably shorter. I haven't got a dyno, I'm just talking about my butt dyno here, but I do think it's real. It was quite a surprise. And the final thing that I noticed is that the oil temperature was cooler. Unfortunately, I don't have the new ECU in this yet, so I don't have it data logged, but I do have an analog gauge in the cabin. I took it out to a skid pan after finally assembling the car at 12:30 the morning that it was meant to go, doing a similar sort of mid-length track where you go out for a couple of laps and come back on a similar day. I would typically get around 120 to 130 degrees oil temperature, and that's since I put the oil cooler in. Taking it out last week, I was getting more around 90 to 110, so it was keeping a substantial amount of heat from getting into the oil, which really surprised me, but is a good effect because it means that I can probably go back down to a 1030 instead of running the 1040. Other than that, I hope you found the video interesting. Like and subscribe if you want to see more. I know what most people are here on the channel for, which is the big boy over there. The next few videos will be on him, but there's still plenty more content on my MX-5 to come up. So hope to see you again.